Good evening. I know the crowds here are small, but we have some almost 60 people online, so that's what happens when it becomes a hybrid event. But we're so glad that we do have you in the audience, and it's very nice to have an in-person event after a couple of years, right? It's really good. It's nice to be with people. So on behalf of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, I'd like to welcome you tonight. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Baha'i Chair. We are thrilled tonight that we are meeting in person, but as I said, we also have an online audience that's joining us tonight, and we're also happy to welcome them. And I want to remind them that are online that tonight's event is being recorded so that they are aware of that going on. It's also my pleasure to say that tonight this event is being co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative. First, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers, especially Dr. Prudence Carter and Dr. Otis Johnson, but of course our own Dr. Rashawn Ray. It's really a pleasure to have them here tonight. And with that, I want to also recognize some very important individuals whose work and whose effortless work has made this event possible tonight. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace in the back. Kate? I know we come to these events and see that everything is set up and everything is looking good and all of that, but we really don't have an idea what goes on in the background as all of these things are put together, and I'm grateful to Kate for organizing all of this. And helping her are two of our students, if they would stand. First, Stella Hudson over there waving. She's our graduate assistant. And next to her, Meredith Friedland, our social media intern. And then, yes, two other individuals that I would like to also bring to your attention that also make the work of the chair possible. They are more in the background, but they equally assist with this endeavor, namely our faculty fellow, Mr. Malik Wilson. Please stand. And in front of him, Miss Lori Allen. Miss Lori Allen is our graphic designer, and if you've ever looked at the Baha'i Chair designs for events, they are just the most beautiful, and she is responsible for that. Now, there are a number of prominent guests here tonight, and I would like to recognize them. And I'd like to begin with Mr. Kenneth Bowers. Please stand. He is the Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. It is the governing national governing body of the Baha'is of this country. And Dr. Rabi Musa, please stand, if you don't mind. Dr. Rabi Musa is a member of the National Spiritual Assembly as well. Now tonight, we have a group of guests who serve on our International Advisory Board, and all of them could not be here. Some are in Dubai, some are in Australia, some are in the UK, and so many of them could not be here in person. But the ones who are here, I would like to recognize, and I'd like them to please stand when I call their name. Ms. Sen Chu, Mr. Douglas Hank, Ms. Mojran Larai, and I think Mr. Zhang is not here tonight. Okay. And then from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, we have some deans and assistant deans with us tonight. So I'd like them to please stand when I call their names. In particular, we have Associate Dean Dr. Catherine Russell and Assistant Dean Dr. Kim Nickerson. So I'd like to go to tonight's program, our roundtable, and to say that tonight's program is an ongoing engagement with structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. And in collaboration with Dr. Rashawn Ray, the Baha'i Chair has invited, I don't know, I've lost count now, and I should have done my statistics, but numerous forward-thinking scholars to our campus and virtually to speak about their research, their insights, and solutions to systemic racism and the root causes of prejudice. The topic receives the highest priority in the educational research and publication goals of the Baha'i Chair, and tonight's roundtable is but an example of that. The roundtable features a recently published book. Dr. Otis Johnson, would you please hold it up? A book entitled Systemic Racism in America, Sociological Theory, Education Inequality, and Social Change. It is comprised of 3 sections and many chapters, which I think their importance lies in the fact that it is an interdisciplinary treatment of the topic. So it's not just one field, but different fields. And I think that makes it very important to understanding this important concept. The book editors are Dr. Rashawn Ray and myself. And of course, we have 2 scholars tonight who contributed chapters to the book, and they will speak to you about what those chapters contain. The book situates our contemporary moment within a historical framework and works to identify forms, occurrences, and consequences of racism, and argues for concrete solutions to address it. So I will now introduce each of our speakers, and then we'll turn the time over to Dr. Ray so that we can start the roundtable. First, I'll start with Dr. Prudence Carter. Dr. Carter is the Sarah and Joseph Jr. Dowling Professor of Sociology at Brown University. Prior to coming to Brown, she was E.H. and Mary E. Pardee Professor and Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Berkeley. Dr. Carter's award-winning book, Keeping It Real: School Success Beyond Black and White, was recognized in 2006, co-winner of the Oliver Cromwell Cox Book Award, given by the American Sociological Association for its contribution to the eradication of racism. Her other books include Stubborn Roots, Race, Culture, and Inequality in the U.S. and South African Schools, and another book, Closing the Opportunity Gap: What America Must Do to Give Every Child an Even Chance. Both are published by Oxford University. Professor Carter's scholarship and writings appear in too many places for me to mention here, and she also has her work featured in many different media. And therefore, again, please go to our website to see the details. But she is currently, and I wanted to mention this, the president-elect of the American Sociological Association. Dr. Otis Johnson, Jr. is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at the Johns Hopkins University, where he has faculty appointments in, and there's 3 different places, Department of Health Policy Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, the School of Education, and Executive Director of the Center for Safe and Healthy Schools, and 3rd, in the Department of Sociology at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He also directs the Institute in Clinical, Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies, Dr. Johnson previously served as a faculty member at Washington University in St. Louis and chaired the African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland. His work on the interrelated topics of neighborhoods, social policy, and race have been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, William T. Grant Foundation, and Spencer Foundation. His work and ideas about social change have been featured again in prominent media outlets. Dr. Rashawn Ray is professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science at the University of Maryland. He is also senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Ray is one of the co-editors of Context magazine, Sociology for the Public. Formerly, Dr. Ray was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and he currently serves on the National Advisory Committee for the RWJF Health Policy Research Scholars Program. Dr. Ray's research addresses mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift, activism, and social policy. He has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and 20 op-eds. Again, many other media places that he appears in, too many to mention. So as you can see, we have an amazing set of speakers for our roundtable. And at this time, I would like to turn the time over to Dr. Ray.
Dr. Mahmoudi, thank you so much. It is always great to see you. Prudence and Otis, it is always great to see you two as well. And I'll be talking about you all in a second. But I also want to definitely acknowledge the board, which I'm definitely proud to be on, and the work that the Bahá'í Chair does here at the University of Maryland just continues to be first rate and above everything else. And a lot of that goes to Hoda. It also goes to Kate, who just simply does a phenomenal job, and all of the other people that contribute to the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. I continue to just be honored to be a part and be able to hang on to part of the work that we do. I definitely want to acknowledge Prudence and Otis for spending time with us and coming out. I know for a lot of people we are still getting comfortable with being out in public, so I definitely appreciate those of you that came this evening, as well as the people who are online. And we know that there's a lot of people online, and we definitely want to give people options on a Thursday night to be able to come out. What I want to spend the time talking about, in addition to talking about my chapter, is just how this came to be. And I think we have to start pretty much 10 years ago, almost to the day, which is kind of crazy we've been here that long. Hoda and I started here at the University of Maryland at the same time, which was fall 2012. And I was coming off my postdoc at Berkeley, and we go to a new faculty, new staff reception at the president's house. And you're standing there and you're new and you're looking around, you're trying to see if there's anyone you know. Well, I didn't really know anyone because I was new. And then no one else really knew anyone either, because they were new too. So people are just standing around, and I see a person kind of across the room, kind of glancing towards me that just looked friendly, I guess the best way for me to put it. And it was Hoda. And so she kind of started coming over, I kind of started going over, and here we are 10 years later. I mean, that's what started this conversation, was why are you here, what work do you do, all of that stuff. But even beyond that, Hoda just wanted to know who I was as a person. Just, what is it like living here, moving here? It was a very friendly conversation, and here we are 10 years later, are not only colleagues, but friends, and Hoda, you just continue to be a person who I highly respect. And so when we started talking about the work that we do, and Hoda started talking about her initiatives, one that she talked about wanting to address was dealing with racism, and primarily prejudice and discrimination. And I said, well, that's one of the things that I do, particularly from a sociological, social psychological standpoint. And so we started talking about what we could do to contribute to the University of Maryland community, also the broader Prince George's County community, and even nationally and internationally as Hoda was thinking about the Baha'i faith. And so what we decided to do was to start inviting prominent top international scholars like Professor Carter and Professor Johnson to be a part of a series of speaking events. And they obliged, and others did as well. And so throughout the course of the years, it just grew. I mean, I remember Otis has done a couple of these. So he did one when he was here. And then when he went to WashU, we invited him back. And now here he is again. So we have to keep including him. And then I remember when Prudence came, I mean, it was just a packed house. Like, everyone wanted to know what you had to say. And again, I can't wait to hear what you all have to say, even beyond just the chapters in the book. But what Hoda and I talked about was, okay, people are coming to speak, that's great. But how do we continue the legacy on pretty much forever? And of course, that is through our written word, through the research that we do. So we then invited you all to write chapters. And you all said yes, along with several of the other scholars. I mean, some of the prominent ones we have in the book, Alden Morris, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, I mentioned them in the same vein as Prudence because all of them have been, and of course Prudence is now, presidents of the American Sociological Association. So just to tell you all the type of caliber of people that we had writing in the book, these are the type of scholars, some of the top ones that are doing this work. We also wanted to highlight some of the work of up-and-coming scholars. So some of my PhD students wrote chapters in the book. Pedro Noguera and Earl Edwards, who was one of his PhD students at the time, who's now a professor up in the Boston area, also wrote a chapter. So part of it was highlighting the continuum of academic thought on systemic racism in America. And my chapter really served as a bookend. I mean, as Hoda talked about, we had these different sections. We started off talking about sociological theory. So we had some of these large kind of tenets around racism in America, Eduardo Bonilla Silva and, Alden Morris and others. And then we got into education inequality because we felt not only was that important for thinking about systemic racism, but even sociology as a discipline. And that's where Prudence and Otis's work lies. And then the third section, which is where my chapter happened to be situated, was on social change. And it was really about how do we move forward. So I kind of talk about that, and then we'll backpack to talk about systemic racism, and then education inequality, and then of course open it up. But one of the things that I wanted to do after seeing all the chapters was to talk about what do we do with this knowledge. And so one of the things that I really put forth is what I call a racially inclusive sociological imagination, a framework by which to guide how we think about this. And what we hope that people would do through reading the book is to become part of the first step of the process, and that is to become what I call a racial equity learner. I think a lot of the issues that we have is that people are not only using different pieces of information, but they're not even in the same book. I mean, oftentimes we talk about how do we get on the same page. You can't even get on the same page if you're not in the same book. And when I have conversations with people, oftentimes people are using information that isn't based in the research, that isn't based in the science. And that is one of the things that we aim to do with this book. In particular, one of the sections in my chapter, and there are others in the book as well, talks about the vitality of critical race theory. And of course, critical race theory in a very overly simplified way simply talks about that in our social institutions, in our policies, our rules, our regulations, our laws, they are laced with racism that we have yet to fundamentally deal with, that leads to advantages and disadvantages among different groups of people. And that, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva says in the book, and of course as he's written elsewhere, we don't necessarily need individual racists for racism to continue. That is part of the systemic part. And when I listen to the broader narratives about racism and about critical race theory and the way that the 1619 Project has been used as a lightning rod, I notice that people miss that. But I also notice that people miss that purposefully because it doesn't necessarily fit the narrative that they're going for. So that becomes the first part, becoming a racial equity learner. I think second, we have to become what I call a racial equity advocate. And I think that's pretty much what you all are, the people who are here, the people who are listening in, is how do we take this information and have conversations with other people? And what I talk about in my chapter is the importance of going into brave spaces. We always talk about safe spaces in the academy. I've always found that to be just an interesting term, because we were having a conversation at dinner, and pretty much all of us were talking about how these universities have really never been that safe, right? At least not intellectual, at least not for the thought. And I think here at the University of Maryland, and through the Bahá'í Chair and the work we do with the Critical Race Initiative and the Anti-Black Racism Initiative, we've aimed to create some spaces. But really what they are, they're really brave spaces though. They're spaces that people have to go into and be willing to kind of go into the lion's den to have conversations that are difficult, conversations that make us grow, right? Nothing really changes or grows unless it goes through some sort of metamorphosis. And I think we have to be honest about that particular part of the process. Accordingly, when you become a racial equity advocate, oftentimes what you do in its simplistic form is you speak up and speak out for marginalized groups and marginalized people who are oftentimes unable to speak up for themselves. And frequently what that means is speaking up for people when they are not present. We are always sitting at different tables that oftentimes are baked in inequality. I mean, even the fact that most of us have a whole bunch of degrees. I mean, there's a reason why we sit at the tables that we sit at. And so accordingly, the people who aren't there are the ones who need us to speak up and speak out. And so I always say that oftentimes this happens at our own dinner tables, at holidays, when your uncle says something racist, when your cousin says something sexist. Are you going to allow your silence to be your acceptance? As my grandfather would say, right? 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, drill sergeant. He would always say, your silence is your acceptance. If you're silent about things you should speak out on, people think you agree with them. So becoming a racial equity advocate is speaking up and speaking out. But the third part is really dealing with the systemic part, and that's becoming a racial equity broker. When you become a racial equity broker, what you do is you interrogate the rules, the procedures, the policies, the laws that govern over us, that you are a part of. For some people, that's as simple as a homeowners association, where they still have restrictive covenants on the books, where a lot of us in this room would not be able to live in those neighborhoods, even though de facto we can now, right? We do, but really, if someone really wanted to enforce the laws that are there, we couldn't. And that's one thing that I challenge a lot of people to do. And when they look at that, they're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this is still here. Well, you can change that by becoming a racial equity broker, right? When we start looking at the schools that our kids go to, not only the massive ways that they're segregated, which we'll hear about, obviously, but also the way that they just continue to perpetuate inequality that leads to certain people having opportunities over others. Well, we make those decisions. We can decide oftentimes how we want our tax dollars used. We can make decisions about what happens in our own neighborhoods. We can also make decisions about what happens in our workplaces. And we can look at those workplaces and say, are they representative of what's going on? So I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Carter to talk about, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Professor Mahmoudi, and thank you, Professor Ray, for having me. And now we're on first name basis after that.
Right.
And I also, I feel very uncomfortable given that we're talking about such powerful social forces, and the status markers mean nothing to me if we haven't done anything to help eradicate the problem. So I'm Prudence tonight, even though I wrote this chapter as a sociologist who has really fundamentally dedicated her life to trying to figure out how to speak when you're invited to the table to speak. And I grew up with relatively modest origins from the Mississippi Delta, grew up under segregated, de facto segregated schools. My parents were school teachers, Mississippi school teachers, lowly paid. So education, my grandmother was a teacher who went back at like 40, in this deep South. That was one of the only things you could do with under segregation to be upwardly mobile. So I think a lot about the social institution of education. But as you know, from also reading in the news and living in your communities, it's a political institution as well. It's a cultural institution. And there's a lot going on in that space that we thought could be utilized, education, as a mediating factor to kind of reduce the consequences of our history, of the very origins and beginnings of this country. And one of the things that I tried to attempt to do in this chapter is to bring together what I call the ecology of inequality that undergirds, that scaffolds and helps to reproduce the systemic part of racism. And what do we mean by that? I really want us to unpack that, because we talk about systemic and we talk about structural. And as a sociologist, I've always been a little bit of a closeted historian, because I know that I can't think about where we are today without recognizing how this country was formed. And how, in the very origins, the genesis of the making of the republic, racism was deeply embedded. Because first, the acquisition of the land that became these United States of America happened through settler colonialism and genocide. And then the actual capital system that made us go on to become a global superpower was built on the backs of my ancestors, of our ancestors. In addition to the infrastructure in this country being built on the back of those who were actually the descendants of those who were subject to conquest and the acquisition of land from Mexico, or immigrants coming from China and Japan. These are the things that we have to remember as we try to understand the divergences that happened in the post-civil rights movement from the 1950s to the 1960s. So where I start is by at least naming history. I don't delve into it because I'm not a historian. But what I do mention is a missed moment for the United States to actually equalize a little bit, and that's post-World War II when the GIs came home. And we had the GI Bill. And that was a bill that allowed literally hundreds of thousands of GIs to get access to higher education, which we now use as a part of our ideology. The more education you get, the more likely you'll get a good job and you'll be a productive citizen in our society. Well, yeah, a lot of GIs actually got to do that. They hadn't finished high school, or they finished high school and they went on to community college, or they went on to four-year universities. Many of them went on to graduate school, but guess what? They were mostly white males. Because of the system of segregation in our country, that opportunity was denied to many black GIs. In addition to that bill, there was access to the loans, the mortgages that would help to buy the houses as suburbia started to be seeded and grow. And those homes were being built out on Long Island and Levittown, or, here in College Park, Prince George's County, wherever they may be. The excerpts, the suburbs, right? But who did not get access to those things? Those resources, because of de jure, institutionalized forms of racism, redlining an actual bank process that was sanctioned by the federal government until we get the Fair Housing Act in the late 1960s. Why does that matter? So my chapter has to lay out the macro, historical and the political and the economic. Why does that matter? Because that creation of suburbia with those homes started to lay the foundation for the growing of intergenerational wealth in our society. For most of us, our wealth is embedded in our property. And who had access to that versus who didn't have access to that is highly correspondent to who's doing well, which groups are thriving on average in this society and which are not, ethno-racially. And here was the problem about that, right? is that many of us say, well, there are other groups that didn't have access, but they've come into this country and they've done well too. That's another talk. I'm going to suspend that because about the actual capital that many of those children of the second generation of immigrants in this country had access to. Many of their parents were highly educated. But in this country, for those of us who had no choice because we're the descendants of the enslaved or the descendants of those who were subjected to genocide or conquest, it is no coincidence, I argue, that those are the groups whose children are not thriving as well in our opportunity structure. The wealth gap is really large. The economists show us, as I write, how wide it is, to the point that even highly educated African Americans in this country, their median wealth is less than those who are white with a high school degree. That's just how drastic it is. Now, why does that matter? It matters because it's also linked to neighborhoods. It's linked to the pattern, which Otis will talk about, the patterns of our housing location. And our houses and our tax assessments are linked to how much revenue we actually generate for local education. Now imagine Black centers, and I spend a lot of time writing about Black and Latinx populations, where the housing ownership, the home ownership is actually relatively low. How do you then produce the dollars? The higher tax assessment, as opposed to the neighborhood where I live now, or where I lived in Berkeley, California, or Shaker Heights, Ohio, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, where, these are college university towns, or Prince George's County, kind of come closer. And you think about what's generated through home ownership over time, who's had access to that, how that produces wealth, how that produces a stream of income for schools. Opportunity gaps are then created, I argue, that engender, produce, and sustain achievement gaps. And closing the academic achievement gaps have been the mantra in educational policy for decades now. In fact, the federal government spent billions of dollars since the passage of No Child Left Behind trying to really reduce that, because it was so racialized when you disaggregated the data on test scores, in addition to looking at English language learners and other groups, right? Those who are poor, those who are working class and poor, free and reduced lunch. And so what I try to do is to kind of lay out the ecology of how these systemic forces, macro level forces, then operated to create these kinds of communities where our social networks are determined by who lives in our communities, who goes into our schools, who attend our children's preschools and stuff. And those become informational networks and what we sociologists call social capital. So then that all gets also wrapped into each other. And then within our personal spaces, our personal and private networks, we continue to produce and sustain narratives about the other versus ourselves. And one of the things that we sociologists have been able to find, and other social scientists, is to think about how it is in this country. When we first mass-produced education, we wanted literacy, we wanted numeracy among more people who were uneducated, many of them who were immigrants in the initial flows of immigrants in this country, including Black migrants from the South after slavery, during Jim Crow, up into the Rust Belt cities in the Midwest and such. We first wanted those folks to have some basic education so that they could sustain economic productivity for this country, according to what historians tell us. But then over time, as we became more anxious about education, we started succumbing to opportunity hoarding. And that opportunity hoarding, who was hoarding? Not consciously. I'm not necessarily saying we're intentionally trying to harm others. But we're colluding in a system of inequality, even in our day-to-day activities, because we want what's right for our own. And not thinking about how our own housing and school practices actually supporting segregation, whether or not we caused it or not, actually being okay with our schools being predominantly white or Asian or upper class, and not too many of those black and brown kids in, because the narrative is that they're not going to be as high achieving, and they'll bring our kids down. So that we keep sustaining those narratives, because we want to be competitive so that we can ensure that our kids will get to the good schools and get the best jobs. That's how it's systemic, from the macro to the micro. The micro is about what we do as individuals in our day-to-day lives. The macro is about what actually laid the foundations and the contours. And the meso is about how our communities and our networks and all of those things actually help to hold all of this together. And it becomes very complicated and hard to disentangle, primarily because we don't use racialized language. And we highlight how it's racialized in this book. We highlight how it's systemic. But we don't use racialized language. We tend to fall on the euphemistic. We just want the best for our children. We just want to live in the good neighborhoods. That's coded. We want to go to the best schools. And we want to be competitive globally and nationally. And that competition, that access to resources, is all fueled by practices and policies that have been fundamentally unequal towards black and brown people. That's real, that's fact, that's history, that's sociology. And it becomes a fundamental ethical and moral question for us eventually, about what are we going to do to stop it. I'm going to say this last thing, because I know this is what's in the news more recently. We get even more anxious when the NAEP scores come out. So these are the National Academic and Educational Progress, is it academic? Assessment of Educational Progress, thank you, Otis. And this is literally looking at how our children across randomized samples across the nation, how well they're faring in terms of English language and math. And are there other science? I just hear about, reading, for third graders. And the latest results show in the reports that if you compare before and after the pandemic, the gaps, the disparities by race are even more drastic. Like the performance of children who are Black and Latino actually plummeted. And there's a lot of angst about this, and talk about learning loss. And part of the problem is, I would say, Kelvin Wellner and I used this metaphor in the Closing the Opportunity Gap book that we edited with a lot of interdisciplinary scholars. I'll leave you with this more like an analogy. It's like we are asking, based on our history, groups of kids who have been allocated to different modes of mobility. Some have access to elevators that go at the rate of a bullet speed train. Some are on escalators going up and up and up, and the cogs are well oiled. And some are on stairwells with missing handrails and broken steps. And we're saying to all those kids, you better get to floor 16, college, or floor 12, high school graduation, at the same rate of speed. Now, who do you think is going to get there first? That is what we're asking for in American society, based on the history and a setup and a foundation that we have never remedied, that we've never repaired. That's what makes it systemic. And that's what makes it hard. And then we use cultural narratives to convince ourselves that it's no longer really about the past. I didn't have anything to do with what my grandparents did. But it is the enduring legacy. And the contemporary consequence is not just history, it's what we continue to reproduce. And that's what I argue in my paper. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Otis.
There we go. Good evening.
Hi.
I want to thank Professor Ray and Professor Mahmoudi for the opportunity to come back and to be part of this wonderful project. I was telling Hoda before the program started that work like this would have been so useful for someone like me when I was in my graduate program, and I'm just so happy that we now have a volume that'll talk about, in a transdisciplinary way, systemic and structural racism and how they impact all of the life chances of minoritized communities and students in this case. And with that, I want to start really reflecting on my chapter, the one that I contribute to the volume, by what is not mentioned in it. I am a product of public education. I am a first generation college student. I was raised in low income neighborhoods, went to low performing schools. I flunked, and I graduated with probably a C+ average from high school. And so the reason why that's so important and why that provides the context for my contribution is that when I became a doctoral student, I started reading and trying to make sense of my own experience. I quickly learned that there was a belief that there was a declining significance of race, right? And that somehow this macroeconomic change phenomena had just made all of the life chances and all of the disparities that characterize our distribution among education, employment, whatever the variable is, related to social class and less so to race and ethnicity. And I was troubled by that. I wasn't buying it. And I quickly started to understand our own work and profession as scientists as not free of a social politics around race. And what do we do then with that when we have research that are positioning particular communities and solutions to particular problems as something that can be achieved through social class and policies that relate to economics? And even then, I felt as though we were really naive that somehow we could fix what's going on with those families in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty without any change or addressing the other end of the economic distribution in which all of us are connected, right? So what are we going to do about the problem of concentrated affluence? Is it not part of the economic distribution as well? And during that time at which the concentration of poverty was growing at a pretty fast clip between 1970 and 1990, especially in Black communities, the concentration of affluence was actually outpacing the growth in concentrated poverty. So we had a really serious problem with economic class distinctions within neighborhoods, but at the same time not considering what that meant for the upper end of that distribution. But let's get back to the race question, because that was, my lens, and I'm trying to make sense of what's happening in minoritized communities, especially around achievement. So I start to read, and the narrative is that within those neighborhoods that are very poor, concentrated in poverty, living in communities where 40% or more of the residents there are living at the poverty level or below. The narrative was that then in those neighborhoods, kids did not learn and teachers did not teach. And that reform was especially hard to achieve in schools in those neighborhoods. So I started looking at the National Assessment of Educational Progress indicators, but more so than that, there also were NCES data sets, and that was the National Center of Education Statistics, longitudinal databases over time that would also show these disparities in achievement, math, and reading, and so forth. But to my surprise, I noticed that the gap in reading was actually converging over time from 1970 to 1990 at a clip to the point where the reading gap, the black-white reading gap, would be gone in 25 years. It was converging in mathematics also from 70 to 90 at a clip again where we could see in our lifetime an actual convergence of the black-white achievement gap in mathematics. Also, and Prudence mentioned the GI Bill, we actually saw a surge in minority college rates to the point where actually in the 70s at one point, black college going rates eclipsed those of whites, largely because of the GI Bill. The point is, at the time when we saw a doubling in number of neighborhoods of concentrated poverty exclusively within black neighborhoods, we actually saw a decline in achievement gaps. So I looked a little further. I said, well, maybe this is due to some other type of trend. So I looked at the kids of parents who did not finish high school. And I found that it wasn't because of the achievement of high-income African Americans, it actually was because of the achievement, the stronger performance over time of kids of parents who had not graduated from college or graduated from high school or had just less educational attainment. And so then I also looked, I said, well, you know, maybe this, so we know it's race and we know this class thing with parental education. Maybe it's location. Maybe because of some outward migration, perhaps those kids who accessed those schools that Prudence was talking about in the suburbs were African American and therefore had greater performances. And sure enough, that was wrong. Actually, the trend for those kids that were in disadvantaged neighborhoods was also ticking up. So on all three indicators of race, class, and location, we saw from 70 to 90 a convergence of the math and reading gap at all three age groups that NAEP assesses from 70 to 90. Leading Chris Jinks at the time to say, we have had the highest achieving black population we've ever had. So I was struck with that. That's not the narrative that you hear about Black and Latinx performance. First of all, that's the first thing. But secondly, how can we see concentrated poverty growing, but resilient test scores among those populations? And I'm not saying concentrated poverty is not bad. It's horrible. In fact, I would say perhaps the convergence would have been even greater and quicker if it were not for them being in concentrated poverty. But the point that needs to be made here is that we need to explain what happened. So, of course, the narrative was, well, it couldn't have been racial segregation within neighborhoods because that had been unchanged largely over time. There's not been more than a 5% variance in exposure, black-white exposure, in 30 years, you know, since we started looking at those exposure rates. But the thing that really kind of got my attention was when William Julius Wilson said, you know, race is really not characterizing what's going on in neighborhoods, is economics, and really race is now in the socio-political realm, not in the economic and job market realm. even though schools are the place for job and labor market skill development, so I don't know how we can divorce the two in the way that he tried to. But nonetheless, I started then looking at schools, and it's there where we can find a possible solution to this dissonance between macroeconomic change and achievement trajectories. And it's because while those neighborhoods were growing poor, those schools were actually becoming more integrated because of desegregation policy. And we know that desegregation actually lifted the scores of African Americans and did not harm the scores of other kids. We also know that there was a time in which desegregation was in force and when it waned. And now we know that schools are more segregated today than they have been complete segregation. But the point is that race did matter, that we somehow had a narrative within the social sciences, and I hate to call it the Wilson paradigm, but we really did start looking at all these spatial mismatches and skills mismatches and all these other economic ways of understanding how joblessness and unemployment rates mattered, and we didn't invest half as much in understanding how race mattered. And that's why it pained me to be sometimes in that sociology, right? That would marginalize the race research and privilege really what was centrist social science that had a political intent that actually defied what could ever be probable and implementable within reality. We weren't ever going to do anything about that concentrated affluence. It's never going to be a policy position of the United States, right? And it is a fallacy to think that you're going to do something about concentrated poverty without thinking about the full distribution of economic opportunity. But worse than that is that somehow that fallacy becomes more tenable to you than race and systemic racism and structural racism. When we can invest heavily as a scientific field in that type of research, only to marginalize what really is hugely important and real to people like myself who were kids in those segregated, predominantly Black, low-income neighborhoods, then there needs to be some reckoning in social science and some critique about the practice of sociology, and in hopes of coming to a more liberationist and abolitionist approach to social life. Thank you.
Yeah, look, you all see why Dr. Carter and Dr. Johnson are up here. I mean, and their chapters, obviously, you can imagine how great they are. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Mahmoudi, who's going to talk about her chapter and really what is very foundational to this discussion, and that is how we think about prejudice and discrimination and the role that those processes play in thinking about education and opportunity structure in neighborhoods.
Thank you. I don't want to stop this wonderful conversation, but my chapter basically examines the long history of racism in this country and really goes back to the founding of this country, as others have said tonight. You can look at the notes of Jefferson in his notes, and there's a place where he actually says that there's no way that you can get the whites and the blacks to come together. There's just no way. And, it starts there. It starts at the very beginning. And the chapter examines how it still is with us today. Maybe not as stark as it used to be, but certainly it's both systemic, as has been said here tonight, but it's also, I always look at this concept of prejudice at the individual level. I think it is something that we have to pay much more attention to in educational settings, far more attention to this concept of prejudice. Where does it begin? How are children socialized? So that as they grow older, they are embedded with this idea that there's actually a group of people that's more superior to another group of people. You know, that is a very important issue for anyone in education and other places to really examine what is the system, what is the kind of, I want to call it knowledge system that promotes racism, that promotes prejudice, that promotes this idea that someone is superior than someone else. Given all the scientific data and all the findings that we have, why is it that this still exists? And how can we get rid of that knowledge system that promotes this? How can we pull it out from its root and destroy this continual promotion of prejudice? So I'm interested at that individual level. But I also think, and I cover this in the chapter, that sometimes we don't fully understand what structural racism means. I really feel that sometimes we don't realize how every institution in this country, for example, interconnects so many policies and procedures and promotes a culture and attitude that really, again, promote racism as an institution, as an organization. You know, way back when I studied sociology, my area was organizational sociology, complex organizations. And the whole study of complex organizations for my dissertation was the structure of an organization and how that impacts everything. So the reason I think this systemic racism is so important for us to really begin to make it more real for people, for all of us to understand better, me included, is because it is such a deeply ingrained, rigid system. And to get rid of it, I think nothing short of a radical change will bring it about. Now, that's easier said than done. And so I want to tell you a little story tonight, and I usually don't like to talk about my own experiences, but I'm going to risk and do so tonight. My experience combating systemic racism at a small liberal college, it was a liberal arts college in Midwest, challenged my own assumptions, my own values and principles, and my own commitment to the cause. I was surprised at how this work requires a large amount of attention and diligence. I also realized that without dynamic leadership, the status quo will remain and all of its negative attributes will continue. I came to a college, it's called Olivet College, that was founded in 1844 by the abolitionist Reverend John Shepard, who also founded Oberlin College in Ohio. Like Oberlin, Olivet was among the earliest, the very first institutions of higher learning in this country to welcome both blacks and women. Incredible history. But in 1922, before my arrival at Olivet College, an incident occurred that challenged this institution's reputation and the very principles that it espoused. As Isabel Wilkinson described the incident in her New York Times article in 1992, and I quote, "A racial brawl brought unspoken hostilities to a boil and turned the campus into a living example of the tinderbox that race can still be in this country more than a generation after the civil rights movement." In that lobby of a dormitory named after the college's abolitionist founder, Reverend John Shippard, racial epithets were shouted at the black students as the two sides rumbled on the gray linoleum. 2 students, one black, one white, were injured and briefly hospitalized. Afterwards, blacks and whites who had crammed together for midterms and shared lunch money and dormitory rooms could not look at each other in the face and were no longer on speaking terms. End of quote. It's hard not to be moved and saddened by the irony here. An institution devoted to principles of equality itself falling prey to the social contagion of racism and dispute. Of course, as anyone who has ever been young knows, that's all of us, young people are apt to stumble into foolish actions. No one at that university, none of those students were more than 22 years old. As such, young people should be encouraged to consider their actions and change their ways. Yet ultimately, and I think this is extremely important, it is the adults who must lead the way. I have to tell you that when I arrived at the college, I was ready to work. I was patient, but at times it was very hard to be patient, and being patient itself was labor. This was and is extremely tough work, is what I learned. We had goals and we accomplished some of them, but I still think about the goals we did not accomplish. Should I have pressed for more in a certain instance? In another instance, did I press so hard that instead of getting things done, I actually wearied my colleagues? The work of countering systemic racism is labor intensive, and everyone, regardless of gift, capacity, or temperament, needs to engage in this work. The shy people can write letters. The sociable person can shake hands. The person who is a good listener can listen. The person who is a good speaker should speak. Each of these things is important, and everyone has a role to play, and everyone can do something about eradicating systemic racism. Looking back at the events prior to my arrival and to what happened after I was there, I came to the conclusion these young people simply deserved better leadership. They deserved men and women who were willing to stand in the gap and declare an end to all this and get to the root of the conflict. They deserved men and women who would insist that the resolution of this conflict abides within the history, principles, and norms of the institution. They deserved men and women who would seek both justice and mercy, but also truth and grace. Somebody needed to be the adult. They needed to do not what was possible or popular. They needed to do what was not popular, but what was right. My time at the college made some things very clear to me. It was not enough to espouse noble values without rolling up one's sleeves to do the work. The labor, and it is labor, of seeking to change the world community by community, institution by institution, and individual or person by person can be lonely and dreary. You won't always have people on hand to pat you on the back. Indeed, sometimes the reward for labor is more labor, And the reward for a good deed is a bad deed directed your way. You must stay affixed to a principle, to a higher calling. You must endure and stand strong. You must remember why you are here in the first place and learn to work before an audience of one. Now, one of the many reasons I am proud and honored to sit here with these amazing colleagues and others at this institution and throughout the world is that each one of them, in their own way and in their separate locales, put their hands to the plow, as it were, in ways both seen and unseen. I can tell you all for certain that each time you hear their name mentioned, their article published, their work celebrated, there are some 10, 20, 50, 100 other times their hard work goes unnoticed. Yet they continue to do it. Not because it is materially rewarding, and not because they always receive attention, but simply because it is the right thing to do. So the chapter looks at the history of racism in the United States, a system that exposes a pattern whereby any progress made towards racial equality has been consistently met by an offsetting force that undercuts the advances obtained. This pattern, whether explicit or concealed, recycles the forces of oppression to counteract social gains when and where they occur, a pattern that can be deeply discouraging, causing many to lose hope. In our own time, we are witnessing a broad resurgence of racism and cultural fragmentation in our society, a development that threatens to divide us as a people and fracture the racial progress that has already been made. Our book examines how the persistence of racism challenges all to work harder to eradicate the evil of racism from the American nation. Sustained and systematic commitment to combat sustained and systematic discrimination is required from both individuals and institutions. We all shoulder the burden of acting for the promotion of racial equality. White Americans are critical actors in any broad attempt to defeat systemic racism. Fair-minded individuals of all backgrounds must work with their communities and institutions to eliminate systemic racism. All of us must think clearly and critically and be prepared to take immediate and bold action in order to secure a future free from the ravages of racism and discrimination. My hope is that when you read the book, you will see your own role in trying to eliminate not only this scourge of racism and prejudice, but how to begin to really radically change this whole area of systemic racism. Thank you very much.
Simply phenomenal. Look, as you all see, if you haven't read the book, you clearly need to get it and read it. We want to open it up for discussion. Any questions that people in the audience might have, any comments? Also, if you're watching virtually, you can, I believe, type probably questions in the chat, and we will get those questions and be able to address those. And so if anyone has questions, we can start with the people who are here.
And you can go up to the microphone so everyone who's not here can also hear you. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you all very much. That was fascinating. Professor Carter and Professor Johnson, you both mentioned something that reminded me of a suggestion we've all heard. And while there's no panacea, it has been suggested that if we could change one thing, we would change the way the public schools are funded locally, rather than on a broader, let's say, statewide basis. And I was curious whether the two of you thought that, or perhaps the question is, how much would that help if you suddenly were able to wave a magic wand and eliminate that local funding of public schools?
Yeah. There, as I'm sitting here listening to us, I was thinking about the absolute versus the relative. I think more funding in any public educational setting that has been severely under-resourced is absolutely going to be something that is necessary. The inputs matter to the outputs. And so particularly if it can be invested in the most fundamental and determinative inputs like high quality teaching and instruction and curriculum. You know, in some communities it means also paying attention on a wider level to other needs of kids, like we need actually lunch programs, meal programs. That's the only meal for many kids in impoverished communities. A lot of the times, enriching extracurriculars. So I'm gonna say that yes, when it comes to the equitable funding, and many of these children also need certain kinds of health care or extra support in the schools. So you get that and you say, okay, that's the basic threshold, and it could actually facilitate some absolute improvement in the reduction in disparities. My struggle as a social scientist is the relative gap. Because I know for a fact that you don't have to give some public districts, particularly the ones where there is the concentration of affluence, as much money because of the resources the families can bring into it. And in fact, in districts where I've lived, there are actually endowments. I lived in a public school district, affluent neighborhood, where each child was asked to give $500 to $1,000 extra a year to the extra fund. So you put that on top of whatever public dollars, you still have a relative difference. Whereas you go into schools that get just their funding from the state, and they may get something sufficient to meet certain thresholds, but you still have that relative difference where they can use the extra funds to bring in extra tutorial support or send kids on. I mean, I was in a school doing research where the kids were literally traveling all over the world. And that capital, that experiential learning is so incredibly rich, and also it matters. And certainly if you're trying to apply to highly selective colleges and universities. So the relative differences don't necessarily disappear, even if you get to absolute improvement in funding and you call it equitable funding. It's not, and equal funding certainly is not where we're trying to talk about, because some districts, they are so under-resourced they will need more. But the more is never relatively more. It's absolutely more, if that makes sense.
I think that answer was spot on about funding, so I'm going to take a different approach. And first question, where does the productive technology of schools lie? And the reason why I say that is because we can say funds, and funds are, you know, they're important. But if we say resource, then that includes more things. And if you look at our nation's best data about schools, let's say the ECLSK, out of the Center for the National Center of Education Statistics, it measures 14 different types of resources, and says, the data show that African Americans in the schools they attend rate lower on all 14 measures. The reason why I bring that up is because one of those measures is high expectations. So if you're asking if we can equalize humanity for those kids, that is the most essential resource we can give them. That's what is required. Dollars, yes, important, but until we can start caring for our Black and brown kids, and investing in them, you know, a life of exploration and achievement and care, then, you know, it doesn't matter how much money you give them.
That's true.
So I would have us rethink what the resource is, and then look at ourselves and ask ourselves, why can't we give that to them? And that would be my answer.
I'd like that answer much better than mine. And the reason, I mean, if I could just follow up, Otis, you know, I hear particularly teacher practitioners and teacher educators say, one of the most fundamental inputs and critical that you give is the pedagogy of love.
Yeah.
Is the pedagogy of love, and joy,
and excitement,
and engagement.
Yes.
And I don't want to get too far because it's easy for us to get behind the class and the money framing. Mm-hmm. One of the fundamental reasons why the love can be inhibited, to get back to systemic racism, and to tie it in, Hoda, to your thing about prejudice, it is not to essentialize, and I want to say this, but more than 3/4 of American public school teachers are white women, and they're teaching a lot of kids of color in schools, and they've come from radically different backgrounds, and they have creations of stereotypes about each other, and the pedagogy of love gets really, really hard to, because the stereotypes, the prejudices, the implicit biases, the formation of expectations, not being familiar with the material conditions, inhibit the ability to really teach, to reach the child. And that's how all that other stuff permeates the school walls into the classrooms. And so when I say high quality instruction, I'm not just talking about knowing how to teach your subject matter. That's what we need to know, that the relational is also really critical. But the relational is impacted by what you say, how we're raised, the boundary, the segregation. It actually creeps into schools via our teaching force. And that's a hard one that we need to actually tackle.
So I wasn't planning to speak, and I didn't realize there was going to be this big emphasis on education. My name is Jerome Dances, and I used to teach mathematics here. And since about, 2002, I had been harassing the Maryland State Department of Education. And my perspective from that of a math department was that the several big problems are when the state licensing test to be one that actually shows that the prospective teacher knows the subject that they're going to be licensed in. And currently, a major problem in math education is that it doesn't do that. And certainly, I mean, the simplest thing is to say that for the elementary school teacher takes the Praxis 2 test, and if they don't happen to like arithmetic, no problem, you just skip all the arithmetic, and you answer the other questions. The other thing that's needed are viable textbooks, I'll say readable textbooks. So I was briefly I was charged this year I was briefly as an official of the state of California charged with looking at some middle school math textbooks that were actually written for students who were a year behind. And what jumped out at me was that the writers of those textbooks hadn't a clue how to write mathematics so it would be understandable.
I'm sorry, is there a question? Because there are other people probably waiting to ask
Well,
questions.
I do have a question which is not related to this.
Okay. I just, if you could just, yeah.
Sure. So we're going through this pandemic, which has had the lockdown, which has greatly, it has greatly mucked up people's lives. And we've also had people who caught COVID and then they got long COVID, which makes it really hard to work afterwards. And so that's the second way that lives have been mucked up. So I would ask, my question would be, how does that play into to the work that you're doing?
Thank you. Otis? Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I believe we need to have a game plan about how to respond to COVID and do much better than we did getting into the pandemic. It was clear that schools were not prepared, and at the time I was serving on a school board. And so that was a moment where we had to, within a month's time, transition to hybrid learning, make sure that there was equipment for kids at home and internet service. We had to negotiate with internet service providers because some of them were not providing service to those families because of outstanding bills and so forth. So it became a really big task. And even as we emerged from it, it was clear that we didn't do our best, that there were inequities during our response to COVID that really made things worse. Now, Dr. Carter, Prudence, mentioned earlier something about the NAEP test scores and how there are huge inequities now and disparities in those levels of performance according to race. And our response may be remediation. And I'll quoting one of my late colleagues, Bob Slavin. We really need acceleration instead of remediation. And the thinking behind that is we can't just be aiming to catch up, close the gap. We actually have to do more, because what was apparent before COVID was there were inequities that we did not see or did not care to see that we now have to address as well as what COVID itself caused. I hope we actually end up better and stronger in terms of our systems, especially in our thinking about the interrelatedness of education and health now than we had previously. And that now is moving into other areas of education, especially with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, where they're now making mental health services, or at least enhancing them within schools. I think that is an area of research, but I also think it's definitely a needed emphasis in practice on how we address health and education. And so I would answer in that way. It might not get exactly to what you were talking about, but those are nonetheless the ways in which I think we can move forward post-COVID.
Thank you. I think we have a question from one of our online audience.
I do, thank you. We have 3 questions online, so I'll start with the first and then we can work through the others. So the first question is, do the panelists agree with Ibram Kendi's conclusion that we cannot educate, train, or protest, i.e. change hearts and minds, our way to an anti-racist society, but must systematically dismantle the policies and systems that are perpetuating racial inequality and injustice? Further, if this dismantling involves going up against widespread opportunity hoarding and elite capture, then is this not fundamentally a political matter as well as a social, economic, or spiritual one?
Whoa. Yeah, that's a big question. And
Yeah, I would jump in and say I wouldn't say that that's just his thinking either.
Yeah,
It's been said decades ago.
right. I also think I wanted to when in writing about the ecology of inequality, all of this stuff is so interrelated, and so even if we talk about the pandemic and COVID, we have to talk about the fragility of economic segmentation by race and class, right? Like who lost their jobs, what shut down, who didn't have child support, right? Who had to work in certain, like I'm thinking about the home health aides and the caretakers, but couldn't afford to have someone at home with their children because we didn't have the programs in place, right? Or their children didn't have access to tutors like those of us who had, what was that at the time they were talking about the groups, the middle class families with pandemic pods and who had access to pandemic pods.
Right.
That's all systemic, that's all related to race and class, right? It's all related to policy. It's all related to the fundamental flaws in the labor market where we live in a country that doesn't have a safety net that provides adequate health care or support for workers, that is actually cheaper to stay. It would be better off if a mother had to decide, or a parent, that I'm going to leave this $12 an hour job because I can't afford to leave my little kids at home, or I can't afford health care. Child care. And I have to take care of my children. And how many kids disproportionately who are racially minoritized were exposed more to death because of COVID? Because all of this stuff is related. It's not even, I care not, and I could get in trouble for saying this. Under that pandemic, I was more concerned about the overall holistic well-being of young people in this society and their families than whether or not they scored well on a test. Because these children learn so much more in other spheres of life. Many of them had to become caretakers themselves, or they took on other tasks and responsibilities, or they learned how to survive in the face of a pandemic, something that all of us have only experienced once, unless we were around in 1918. So, it is the case that we can't dismantle this just by having good feelings and values and sharing those. We need fundamental policy change in American society.
Yes, totally agree. I think that this is the difficulty, is how to get us to see the complexity of the system. You know, how to see that this system is not sustainable.
It's not.
And, you know, maybe we think right now it's not impacting me, you know, I'm fine. But really, it's not sustainable for any of us. And as time goes by, we see that. And I think, Prudence, I really appreciate your comments about children during the pandemic, and also mostly the single mothers who suffered. And I'm talking about black mothers in particular, that I don't think that story has been fully told yet. The level of unfairness of the system again that impacted these particular families. Anyway, did you have?
Yeah, I think this is a great moment in our dialogue because it links back to a thought I had actually when you were speaking, Hoda. It's clear we need systemic change, but we also need other systems. I don't know to what extent we can rehabilitate the systems we currently have. And while I am unaware of the technology behind coming up with new systems, but I think we've given a lot of time And that's why I really appreciated when you said patience is labor. We've given a lot of labor, even if it's patience, to changing existing systems. The conversation has to consider that we cannot change those systems. What do we do then? Mm-hmm. How do we go about creating new systems? I don't have the answer. I'm only posing the question, the topic, because I don't know that I have faith in changing existing systems. Now, maybe I'm the cynic of the panel, but I'm going to throw that out there because I'd like to be enlightened about what's next when it comes to this critical question. And I think it is really critical.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, we keep trying to put Band-Aids on something that needs surgery. Like if we use that particular analogy, that's what we keep doing with racist issues, and then they just keep opening back up. I mean, everything that you all are talking about, I mean, first in response to the question, we talked about this earlier as well. I mean, individual races, even though they exist, they're more than there should be, and there are actually more of them than we think they are. They don't necessarily need to exist for the inequality to continue.
That's right.
So I'll highlight a few of these. Before the pandemic happened, and it was serendipitous, actually, there was a report that came out, actually out of Hopkins. Hopkins led it, which is also ironic, given some of Hopkins' history around how we think about health and Tuskegee and the Guatemalan syphilis study, all those things, right? But we putting that to the side. We talking about this particular report they did, which was an international report, leading experts, and essentially what it was looking at is how prepared countries were to deal with the pandemic. Like, it was a fascinating study. It literally came out right before the pandemic. It was almost like, well, you know, people were like, wow, that timing was interesting. So it comes out, they rank countries around the world, and of course, which country do you all think was number one? The United States, right? Until you really started, and of course, this is what I love about being a sociologist, until we started looking at the individual indicators. And what they weighted the most was economic resources. Instead, when you started looking at economic inequality, or rather the way they framed it, healthcare equity was the term they used, the United States was significantly lower than the way that we frame third world countries in Asia and Africa in terms of healthcare equity, in terms of people getting access to that. I also think about early on during the pandemic and the discussion about single mothers and having to make decisions about whether or not you go to work and being frontline essential workers and these sort of things, is one of the reasons why New York City was hit really, really hard is because at the very beginning of the pandemic, they made a decision, they being the city and the city leaders, made a decision to reduce the subway schedule down to like 1 or 2 trains a day. Who does that impact? Probably not many of us in here. Most of us are like, get on the metro, the subway, I'm not doing that, right? It impacted the people who didn't have vehicles, the people who serve us, the people who work at grocery stores, the people who work at restaurants, the people who work at the hospitals, the people who are trying to get their kids from home somewhere else. And so what happened during that process? Let's take a single mother as an ideal type, leaving potentially a high rise, walking past 50 to 100 people to get to a subway where all these other people are also there because there's only 1 train running when it's normally 50. What do you think that's going to do for COVID exposure? So one of the things that just happened to occur at that particular time, I had recently met with Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and I said, I know one of the problems that's going on here. Not only is it about access, and of course, not to mention the fact that if you actually wanted to go get testing early on during COVID, where did you have to go? You had to go to the hospital that was like 5 or 6 stops away from your house because there wasn't access to healthcare in your neighborhood that was predominantly Black and brown and low income. So I said, don't you think that it would make a lot of sense to start using the resources that are here, the churches, the community centers, the barbershops, the hair salons? And they did that. And that was one of the reasons why we started to see COVID testing go up and quarantining starting to occur. And then I said, of course, we also need to think about people who are working, because people who are making $10, $12 an hour are going to work sick because they can't afford to take off because they don't have health insurance, right? So just keep that in mind. And part of the reason why I bring that up is because there's a recent report that just came out looking at life expectancy now, where for Black people and Native Americans, life expectancy, it dropped for all groups, but it really dropped for Black people and Native Americans. And when I say really dropped, like essentially 5 years off of life. You know how big something has to be to knock 5 years off of life expectancy? Like and the other thing, life expectancy was on the rise, right? It's similar to this trend that Otis was talking about with education. How the 70s through the 90s, we had certain policies, we had integration, and then the 90s into the 2000s with No Child Left Behind, lack of resources, all those things with the higher increases in the reliance on local taxes, and we started having these changes. The other thing, I did a report for Detroit, but it ended up being for the state of Michigan, looking at what was happening with COVID in Detroit. And there were a few things that really stood out that really bothered me with our analysis. It was quantitative and qualitative analysis. We analyzed some data with some colleagues at University of Michigan, then we interviewed stakeholders in the city of Detroit and so forth and so on. It was a mental health issue piece. One of the biggest things we found is that Black people were more likely to report knowing someone that had died from COVID.
Yeah.
And it significantly led to higher rates of depression and anxiety. Like that is another part, and particularly among young people, that we're not talking about. Like, I mean, shoot, if you're 10, 15, and people you know have died or they're still experiencing long COVID and all these sort of things, how can you focus at school? Not to mention, then you're dealing with the digital divide because you don't have access to the technology you need to actually do what you need to do in the classroom. The final thing I'll say, and this is the last systemic part, if we just only talk about the pandemic, is we also looked at PPP loans. So loans from the Small Business Administration, right? These were loans given out to help companies. And of course, I think people are now starting to realize how in many ways that was rigged and which companies got it and which ones didn't. But in Detroit, it was very profound because we were comparing Detroit to Wayne County, which is where Detroit is, and then the Tri-County area, right? So the entire area. And we found that people in Detroit who happen to, of course, be more likely to be Black, and then when they did have a small business, not only were they less likely to get PPP money, they also got a smaller amount of it. So this is the way systemic racism operates. It wasn't that they weren't filling out their paperwork correctly. It was that other people had ins and access to banks that housed the money that was actually giving out the loans. And these banks were less likely to be in predominantly Black neighborhoods. They were less likely to have those networks, and accordingly, other people were more likely to have it. See, that's the part of racism that we don't like to talk about often. We talk about the disadvantages. Rarely do we talk about the advantages. The fact that when the small business stuff came out, there were some people calling their banker saying, hey, how do I get access to this? And all of a sudden, it leads to this process where in Detroit, you have less access to it. So what do we do about that? Well, we met with the city of Detroit, we met with the governor of Michigan, and now this report that I'm talking about is actually on the michigan.gov website for people to be able to see the way these inequalities operate. And I think that's what we're able to do as researchers, is to amplify this and highlight these issues. But this is the way systemic racism operates. We talk about education, health, the economy, neighborhoods, all in one thing. And so, of course, it's systemic. And so, look, we can heal people's hearts and minds, but I mean, until we deal with the systemic way that racism operates, a lot of things, unfortunately, won't change as much as we want them to.
But Rashawn, I love what you said, and I want to just add one little thing. I think it's a both and.
Oh, yeah.
We have to have the policies and we have to heal the hearts and minds.
I agree.
And the reason why, I was just thinking as you were talking, the federal government just did the student loan debt forgiveness, right? Look at all the brouhaha around $20,000 of student loan debt. Now, you may have your feelings about it because you paid off your loans or you didn't have any loans. But it's just really, really telling who's talking about it and who resents and dissents. And yet at the same time, they got PPP loans that my tax dollars and your tax dollars paid for. But they didn't want it to go to folks who were trying to get a better opportunity in life.
Yeah. Right.
And who were probably disproportionately actually Black college students.
Exactly.
It's hypocrisy at its worst. The other thing why I say it's habits of hearts and minds, when I think about what's going on in 36 plus states, there have been anti-CRT bills. to literally tackle whatever modicum of multicultural education has gone on in those states across the decades. Because people are fearful of actually producing a more educated, politically enlightened, critically thinking populace.
Right.
Because it's that kind of thought that actually helps to lead to the voting and the civic engagement and behavior that would actually lead to the changes in policies. It's all interrelated, right? So yeah, of course you attack the curriculum. You keep us dumbed down, so to speak. I didn't get to learn my history in school, per se. A little bit. A lot of it happened in the community. And then that changed and it got better for the subsequent generations. Now we want to take it back because that's a little bit too scary. So I think the other thing we have to think for the habits of hearts and minds, people become more expanded the more they know about what happened in history, what happens with economics, what happens sociologically. I think that's why I'm saying we need the both and, because I think that, I don't know, it's a chicken or egg, right?
But you know, Prudence, that relates to your question, Otis, about how do you change the system? What's the technology? And I think what you're suggesting is, well, it has to do with consciousness raising at one point, right? That if we could just understand that when you allow every individual to develop their capacities, to have opportunities, to learn, to thrive, to flourish, all of us learn and flourish and thrive, and the whole society is lifted, you know. But I think that's the challenge, how to get all of us to understand that, you know, these are ways that you build a better nation, that you create a better society. I think that's really the challenge. Kate, can we do one more question? And then I think we have to stop.
Sure. It's a big one.
Thank you.
What 3 policy changes do you think will have the largest effect on changing systemic racism as it exists in America today?
Maybe each of us could take one, and that could be like part of our closing remarks or something.
Was it 3?
What do we think? Well, they said 3. Maybe we give them 4. Each of us do one. Each of us do one.
I would, wow, that is a hard one. Part of me wants to go the housing route, but the other part of me wants to go to justice, and of course there's always education. So I think I mentioned 3 right there, right? But let me mention the thing that has not been addressed today, and that is our problem with anti-blackness and equating blackness with all of the things that relate to harm, criminality, all of these other isms out there end up feeding into the system of dehumanization, which I think is at the foundation of other things: economics, housing, education. And we also see how they're intertwined. I mean, we now have concepts such as the school-to-prison pipeline, right? We know that there is this tendency within our systems and our structure to hyper-masculinize, to think of threat or put things within lenses of adultification if they're young kids, hypersexualization, all of these things related to blackness. And until we understand that process and why we then fear just being in black neighborhoods, being in black schools, I cherish those places. And what needs to happen is a re-engineering of our whole perspective on blackness and its association with everything that's bad. I don't know how we do that, But if I want to say that there's one thing that's at the heart of it all, it would be this historic belief in blackness as criminal, as over-sexualized, and all these other ways in which, you know, we end up dehumanizing that population. So again, not perhaps answering the question because I don't know how we put that in policy, but clearly I think that's where a start would have the most benefit and fruit.
The name of my chapter was entitled "Systemic Racism," something about ending systemic racism requires multidimensional solutions. It's really hard to give one. But the thing that comes to mind for me in every facet of society, and we haven't talked about culture and religion, because a lot of us, in addition to the family, some of the most dominant institutions are media, culture, media, entertainment, and religious spaces. Mm-hmm. And that shapes a lot of how people think about either their own sense of self or how to be in relation to others, how to be empathic or not, how to be generous or not. They matter. And those signals, that symbology comes through those institutions. But if I could be idealistic, because I'm a hopeful person despite everything that's happened, I would want from those two spheres, culture, media, and religion, from school boards to city councils to state legislatures to the governor's mansions to Congress to the White House to corporate America. And and it's a whole nother conversation of whether or not we want to perpetuate the ills of capitalism, okay, but that's another talk. But every facet, presuming that and I'm not sure we can actually do this given the economic foundation of capitalism. Capitalism is kind of zero sums. In order for some to have a whole lot of profit, a lot of people can't have anything. So that's one of the problems. And capitalism is racialized. People write about racial capitalism. But in this democracy, if you could have a radical politic of inclusion from every facet of society, I don't mean diversity, just representation. But to make sure that you can have in conversation people who could increase the likelihood that more people who have enlightenment, who subscribe to a radical politic of inclusion and cooperation and sharing of resources could be representative in every facet of society. That's what I want. And that's, interestingly, the antidote. I mean, look, not to get political, but I am fascinated by what the radical right has done to take over school boards and state houses and governors' houses. It's got to be recalibrated, or otherwise we're regressing.
Yeah.
I
Go ahead, Hoda.
really liked what Prudence just, taking it from the bottom all the way up to the top to change the whole thing. This is a very difficult question, I think, but it has to do with structural justice. I guess I'm thinking policies need to, because see, policies are often partisan. That's the difficulty, is they are often partisan, and therefore that automatically leaves out certain people. And I think it would be, I would like to see policies that look at any issue from what has already been said here in relation to the love aspect, to the grace aspect, to again, justice. What are the ethical, moral considerations of this problem that we have to think about? I know that given some of the cynical attitudes that exist today, that may sound naive, but I believe there are enough good people in the world who would sit around the table and who would start considering the moral aspects first, and then get to the material and the other aspects.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, look, policies can definitely leave out people's thinking, but oftentimes policies really help people, even though they don't know that they're helping them. You know, Lyndon Johnson, one of my favorite quotes is, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best black man, you can pick his pocket and he won't know you're there. Some of the coalitions that need to be built among people who are poor, among people who are marginalized, the system is set up to divide us. But to specifically answer this question about policy, it's one word, it's reparations. If we really want to transform the system, it's about reparations. Look, and the United States is not against reparations. The United States is only against reparations for black people. Like all other groups who have been systematically marginalized and disadvantaged have received reparations. Japanese Americans who were interned, they received reparations. They should have gotten that. They should have got more, but they got it. Indigenous people, Native Americans, receive land, have received money, definitely need to receive more, but have received it. It's always going to be inadequate. But black people, who of course went through enslavement in the United States, have not received reparations. It's a reason why in 1988 we had reparations for Japanese Americans. Then in 1989, Congressman Conyers came up and started advancing reparations for black people. That was part of the process, and people didn't get on board with that, and that's why it's still continuing to this day, and HR 40 is still out there for that particular reason. And going along with that, I think, is what you three are saying, and that deals with truth and reconciliation, and that gets to the both, right? So Sheila Jackson Lee, who is a congresswoman from Texas, is advancing HR 40. And then Barbara Lee, who is a congresswoman from California, is advancing the truth and reconciliation legislation. And of course, we have states like California moving forward. We have Evanston with the plan that we could get into, people have a problem with. We have a couple of other areas that are advancing this. But look, if we really want to get past this, I think that's how we deal with restorative and procedural justice, that we have to recognize that things are highly inequitable, and in the current system, we can't change it unless we do something big. Now, of course, we can talk about things like student loan forgiveness, who it benefits, but even that has to be packaged in a particular way, right? When you look at the Pell Grants, you actually see who is benefiting. Oftentimes, low-income students that are predominantly Black and Latino to deal with that because they still face that financial threshold. We also know if you attended a historically Black college or university, you are more likely to get a subprime loan, and that's also wrapped up in this. But to simply answer the question, reparations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to really, this was a fantastic roundtable. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Carter, Dr. Ray, thank you so much. And I think to thank the audience both here and online, and to know that we all have our work to do. We all have our work cut out for us, and I hope that we think about new ways of tackling the systemic racism and to stay on course, not to give up. And I want to just remind you that our next event, which, there we go. Our next event is actually this coming Tuesday. And I really would like to encourage you, it's online, so you can join that way. But we have, as you can see, Professor Martha Jones from Johns Hopkins University, speaking on democracy, voting rights, and Black women as the vanguard. She's written a fabulous book about the topic, and it's something not to miss because her research is extremely important and very well done, and the topic is very timely. So I hope you'll join us. Go to our website, look for future events, and please follow us on our social media. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's so nice to see you all in person, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.